Oh my goodness, welcome back to part three for how to make a drought map. Thanks for joining me. So in part one, we downloaded 52 weeks of drought data and unzipped it and merged it into a single gigantic layer. And then in part two, we cast this hexagonal fishnet on top of our data and did a join by spatial location so that we packed insight and information into those hexagons so we could do some analysis. And then symbolically, we did size by drought frequency, and then color by drought intensity. And that's a bivariate map. So that's parts one and two. In part three, we're going to play with the symbology and do some advanced symbology in this. Okay, so let's buckle up and get ready. So I want to add a little bit of context to this map, and the best way to do that, I think, a lot of times is to give it a nice simple base map. And instead of imagery or anything like that, which can be too noisy, I'm going to choose hillshade. So in the Living Atlas, I'm pulling in the Topobathy hillshade. And by default, you have this kind of gray color scheme. It goes from black all the way to white. But I want to have a darker tone for this base map, and it's shouting a little bit too much. So instead of white, I'm going to just transition it from black to a gray, a mid-tone gray. And already that's doing a lot more for our data. But because it's a dark background, I want to make the intense areas bright, not dark, right? So all I'm going to do here is just flip this cool Viridis color scheme. Within Viridis, I think this is using plasma or magma, one of those two awesome colors. So I've flipped it, and now I've got all these little hexagons, but they're all kind of flat, and the darker areas disappear a little bit, and the lighter areas all glom together into a single thing. So I'm going to duplicate that hexagon symbol, and I'm going to give it a semi-transparent white gradient. And now I'm just tweaking the size and intensity of that white gradient. So let's zoom in here, see, okay, we do indeed have a gradient going on, and I'm going to push that bright white back down to like 60% transparent white to fully transparent white. I'm going to reduce this shape marker down a little bit. So the result should look a little bit like a cool little reflection. You see that? It just gives it a little bit of dimensionality, almost like a pebbled surface or like lizard skin or something weird like that. Um, and so let's go in here, and I've duplicated my shape layer again. And in this case, I'm going to give it a very faint outline. So it's going to be mostly transparent outline and a fully transparent interior. Just because in that drought-ridden center of the map, all the shapes kind of converge together and I can't really see the discrete hexagons anymore, but now I can. So that's cool. We've got three layers here. One of them is unlocked, so it's able to be dynamically colored. And I've got this layer, which I use frequently as an overlay mask, so it really helps set my area of interest visually and gets rid of all that unnecessary visual detail um, outside of my area of interest. And I'm going to make this semi-transparent and give it a dark gray background. And so what I'm going to do right now is give the outline some semi-transparency and a little bit of a negative offset. And then I just duplicate that stroke over and over and over and over again. Each time I snug it in a little bit with a higher negative offset, and I make it slightly more transparent. And really what I'm doing here is I'm hacking an inner shadow for my shape, which is a shape of not the US. And you'll see when I hit apply here in a second that the result is kind of like a little drop shadow. So check it out. My polygon is rendering. It's got a solid fill and a semi-transparent series of outlines growing ever more transparent at distance. It's kind of a nice little effect. It helps visually attract your eye to what's important. So now in the catalog, I'm duplicating my map, and I'm going to make another map. So the original map was showing drought, and often I find the best way of understanding something is to think of its exact opposite. I don't know why, but it's just helpful to me. And so I'm going to make what I would call an optimist's drought map. So you've got all these areas of horrible drought, but look at all the places that haven't had drought, right? That's kind of interesting. So first of all, I had made a definition query to hide all the hexagons that had 0 months of drought. And now they're all back in my Optimist drought map. So all these hexagons with no drought show up. Um, and I'm just going to go into my symbology and stop coloring by drought intensity. And now I'm just going to flip the graduated symbol rule. So instead of small to large, it's large to small. So areas that haven't had much drought have really big hexagons, and areas that have had a lot of drought shrink down to small hexagons. And then I'm just going to paint them all blue. But what's going on here, right? Look at all these places outside that haven't had drought because there's no data for that area. So we don't want to keep those there. So what I'm going to do is create an attribute, and then later I'm going to use that to hide those errant hexagons. And I'm going to call it omit. I'll just give it a short number. The default value I'll set to 0. So I'm making a new field. I save the field. I'll close this. And I don't know why it says null. It should say 0. So let me just definitely make it 0. So I'm going to right click the field, calculate the field, and I'm going to say you are 0 for everybody. All right, so now I have a new field called omit. They're all 0 values. And now I'm just going to do a quick select by location. And I'm going to say, hey, drought hexagon layer, anybody who has their center in that little USA mask layer that I'm using, go ahead and select yourself. And it'll run, and every hexagon that essentially falls outside of my area of interest is now going to be selected. It's kind of a neat little trick. Now I can open up my attribute table and give the omit value. You can see which ones I have selected. You can see my omit. I'm going to calculate the field, and for these selected hexagons, I'm going to give it a value of 1. So now you can see where I'm getting with this, right? So I'm going to clear my selection, and now I can go back into the definition query and say only show hexagons where omit is equal to 0. And then hit OK. And it's just a sneaky way of hiding data that you don't want to show, but you don't want to get rid of it. You don't want to delete it, which could wreck other layers and instances of the map. And so there you go, the Optimist's Drought map. Let's make a third map and play with some symbology in another way in this map, and we'll call this movingness of drought. So when I first downloaded and merged all these layers, all these just thousands and thousands of drought layers of stacked polygons, there was something interesting about this. While it's just a tangle of black outlines here, it looks like a big hairball, really. If you color code this by its drought data, DM data, something interesting happens. So instead of color coding by fill, I've chosen to color code the outline. And I'll hit apply. I'll go back to my main symbology panel and switch the value that I mapped by to DM, which is the drought intensity. Really weak drought to really bad drought. And for the color scheme, I'm going to choose another one of those Viridis color schemes, Inferno, Plasma, Magma, I don't remember which, just the cool looking one. And see how they all stack up on top of each other? That's pretty interesting. So I'm going to format all symbols at once and just make it incredibly thin, so 0.1 points. And the visual result is that you've got these very faint lines where the drought has kind of been moving and fluctuating, and then solid lines where the drought has been parked. But the strong drought is rendering on the bottom. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to enable symbol layer drawing and just reverse this value and say, DM4 is going to render on top of everything, and DM1 is going to render under everything. And that way, the strongest drought lines render on top because they're most important, which makes sense. Let's see the results render in here. There you go. Okay, so we've looked at 3 different ways of symbolizing and hacking some dimensionality for our point symbols. We then kind of reversed that and turned this concept kind of on its ear to take a look at an optimist drought map. And then we've taken a look at kind of the pseudo motion of drought over the course of 1 year where stacked up lines are more intense. So you have just whiled away 9 minutes of your allotted time on this earth, but it wasn't for nothing. So here's a quick rundown of the stuff that we accidentally learned in the process of playing with map symbology. We duplicated maps inside our project so we didn't have to start from scratch each time. We tweaked hill shading colors from an image service. We played with stacking shadow and reflection sort of surfaces inside symbol levels or symbol layers for in the symbology panel. We controlled the drawing order, so we could control what sort of the data layer drew on top of other data layers. We selected by location, we created fields, and we hid things based on that attribute. And we applied color rules to only the outlines instead of just fills, which is a lot of fun. So anyways, thank you so much for joining me for this, and stay tuned for number 4, where we are going to build a layout and probably finish this thing. Have a great day.